What's my signal? Well, all I can say is, wow, there must be an awful lot of Fletts in Orkney. Good afternoon, and welcome to Day 5 of the Orkney International Science Festival 2023. My name is Eric Walker, and I'm the speaker host for this event, but there's actually several hosts, to be honest, for this event. I'm just going to do a little bit of event housekeeping first of all. If you hear the fire alarm, there are fire exits at the bottom here on either side, and also the exit at the top. But just follow the festival team because we'll be first out the door, okay? If you could please set your mobiles to silent just so the tone doesn't ring if somebody's trying to get in touch with you. But for some of you, or many of you hopefully, oh, where's my slide? If you could keep your mobiles on, because you can use a system called Slido that we're using. If you point your camera of your smartphone at the QR code on the left, that opens up a question and answer thing. You just type your question or your comment in, and I'll gather it up and present it to the speakers at the end. You can also tap in www.slido.com and enter the code 3435541, and that also opens up the question and answer system. However, if you don't want to use that, we have the traditional roving mic, and Catherine there. Just put your hand up and Catherine will keep herself fit by running up and down the steps and across all the theatre here. So now, I think that's my bit done. Howie, I'm going to hand over to you so you can introduce the first person, this first speaker.
Oh, thank you very much indeed, Eric. And I was reflecting this morning that science festivals started in Edinburgh in 1989, but the fact is that the idea of highlighting science through exploration and adventure and fun has surely been around much longer. In fact, probably since the days when humans first started to explore and gather together for enjoyment. Well, for some of us, it started in Stromness back in the 1960s. And that was the time when the Saturday night fancy dress parade in Stromness Shopping Week inspired us then, as it continues to do so today. And you see Roy there on the screen, and it was a very young Roy Drever in Kirkwall who came up with the idea of a science-themed lorry in the fancy dress parade. With the help of his Stromness cousins, John and Erlyn Brown, and a lorry kindly provided by Rowans of Fursbreck at the North End, and a supply of Mrs. Brown's best white tablecloths and white coats from Stromness Academy's Domestic Science Department, plus black smoke-producing carbide from Kirkwall Grammar School. A float joined the parade with the title Modern Science and the Atom. The lack of atomic power was more than made up for by the presence of a wartime stirrup pump from the Browns' attic. Its interactions with the carbide, the white tablecloths, the white coats, and numerous onlookers at the pierhead wonderfully showed the power of science to do the unexpected. Roy carried that spirit of exploration on into all aspects of his life, as I can happily confirm, having shared a house with him in student years, in a student year, and a truly memorable year in Edinburgh. He inherited, I think, that spirit from both sides of his family. On his mother's side, the Fletts, well, that includes his cousin, John, who we heard earlier today in Ice over Orkney, another cousin, Ian Scott of Redland, councillor, farmer, conservationist, long-time chairman of the Science Festival, and of course, as we'll shortly hear, his cousin Jim, our speaker today. Indeed, afterwards, I must buttonhole Jim because I want to find out more about the other side of the family, the Drever side, and the connection, and I think it must be a connection with Professor Ron Drever, the pioneer in gravitational waves. On the Drever side of the family, delighted to see Mike here today, Roy's brother Mike, who was a core founder member of the team that created Orkney Science Festival back in 1991. Also with us is Roy's wife Anne, their daughter Helen, and their son Lawrence, who's joined the festival team to introduce our speaker, Jim. So, Lawrence, welcome. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Howie, and thank you to everyone for coming. As you've indicated, my dad was always a bit of a science aficionado, so he'd have been completely thrilled to have this lecture in his honor. A lot of you will know that it cost him quite a high price, personally. It was 60 years ago this autumn that he had the one fateful day that changed his life. If you can imagine this, he was 17, just a schoolboy really, and he decided that what he'd do one day was make his own fireworks. You've got to understand that this is in the days before TikTok and that kind of thing, so yeah, make your own fireworks. But you see, he didn't quite know everything about the process. So as he was brewing it up there in the kitchen at Sinclairs, where we're staying, he used the wrong type of phosphorus, we think. And so the mixture just blew up in his face. And so from that instant on, he was left blind and one-handed. But you see, the thing about him is he just took that in his stride in life. He just moved on from it, never looked back, never complained. And that was, yeah, it was a new reality. You know, he moved south, he got into computers when it was just starting off. And you see, the thing about him is that, as well as that playful sense, which you also heard about from the Stromness Festival, he was curious about everything. And as you can probably tell, he never really did anything by the book. And of course, he was that persistence, you know, to get through it, move on. And to me, things like that, persistence, playfulness, you're not doing it by the book, that's the essence of the scientific virtues. So he was always a scientist at heart, I would say. And in fact, one slightly haunting thing really emerged after he died last year. We were going through a lot of his old stuff, school books, things like that. And there was one chemistry jotter from the early 60s, and on the very last page that he'd been writing in, had this great big asterisk, and it was this chemical equation for potassium nitrate, in other words, gunpowder, pretty much. This is the last page. So I sometimes wonder if, well, you know, if he'd had one more science lesson, would that have told him enough that you don't go messing with this kind of stuff? Maybe he missed something, I don't know. But knowing him, I think he was always going to do that kind of experimental stuff anyway, and he paid the price. Today, though, let's move on from gunpowder. We'll be talking about another molecule, explosive in its own way, human DNA. And our main speaker this afternoon, he spent his whole career studying that, in between his TV appearances, as you might know. And, well, he's the professor of human genetics at Edinburgh University. He's a leading light of the Family History Society. He's led a huge study into Viking DNA in Orkney. And last but not least, he's a Flett, and he's my cousin. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Jim Wilson.
Thanks very much, Lawrence, and thanks very much, everybody, for coming. I think this must be the biggest crowd I've ever had, so thank you. And thank you, Howie, for the invitation. Hope hopefully we can honour Roy with this lecture. Let's see if we can get the slide clicker to work first. Nope. Yep. So Howie asked me to talk about the Fletts, and I see a lot of Fletts and Flett descendants in the room here, so it was probably a good idea. He suggested that we call the lecture Following the Fletts, so that's what I've done. And I've started here with one of my favourite old things in Orkney. It's the Flett crest, and I was just in to the cathedral just after lunch today to check it's still there. This is the coat of arms of Magnus Flett of Hobbister, which is, as you can see, 3 trefoils surrounding a horn of plenty, a cornucopia. But we'll come round to Magnus Flett in a little while. So, as has been covered already, there have been a lot of Fletts today in the Science Festival. John Brune, myself, we both had Kingshouse Fletts for mothers, as did Roy Drever. And we go back to the Fletts of Rusland in Harray, that you'll hear about in a minute. But we also at lunchtime heard a toast to Provost Jim Flett of Kirkwall, who's pictured here. He's descended from a Flett lineage in Firth in Orkney. Just recently, the last lecture was on Professor Tom Flett, a mathematician and collector of traditional dances. He was also of Firth extraction, and we're going to hear later today about Captain Hamish Flett, the captain of the Earl Thorfinn in the famous 1953 hurricane. So we're hearing about many, many different branches of the Fletts. And there have been many, many prominent Fletts in Orkney history. Butchers. Here we have Adam Flett, the founder of the butcher shop in Stromness. Merchants like in Doomby. Solicitors that you'll know. Builders in Ham. Journalists here in the room. Strongmen. Auctioneers. Here's John T. Flett. But most of all, the Fletts have been farmers. So here we have Tom S. Flett, my granduncle, with a show cow in 1938. This is Annuity the 33rd of Portlethen, my great-grandfather and Roy's grandfather's prize coup. And here is my great-grandfather, Jim Flett of Kingshouse, after the county show with his winning coup. This is Annuity again in 1939. But we weren't all farmers. Some of the family were whalers. Roy's great-grand-uncle, Adam Flett, was born in 1812 in Linneth in Harray. And age 17, he set off to the Nor'West to chase the whales. But it was his last whaling trip that he became famous for, and it generally became very famous indeed, on the Dee out of Aberdeen. And this is because the ship was beset in ice for 5 months and a little while, on the 8th of October, 1836. So obviously they were at 72 degrees north. It must have been unspeakably cold. But they had 9 weeks where the sun didn't get above the horizon. It must have been a horror story. And in fact, when they got back to Stromness in April 1837, there were only 9 men alive out of 46 who'd left. They'd all died of scurvy because they didn't quite understand how to prevent scurvy in the merchant navy. This had been solved in the Royal Navy by that time. And Adam was actually one of only 3 men who could still go aloft or carry a bucket of water. So he must have been quite a tough nut. And he lived to a ripe old age and bought the farm of Handist, just near Doomby in Harray. You can read all about this in James Troop's book, The Icebound Whalers. Now, I was recently in Flanders, in Belgium, and I looked in on Tyncott Cemetery here, from the First World War. And of course, I went round in one of my favourite games looking for some Fletts. And of course, we found an Alexander Flett. And I thought he might be from Orkney. But when we looked him up, he's actually from a place called Raffin in Banff. And we'll come back to these Banffshire Fletts in a little while. When I got home, I realised you could do all this on the internet. You didn't actually have to go to Flanders. And you can look up the Commonwealth War Graves Commission online. And there I found another Flett, a John William Flett, who also died in 1917, and he was from Essex. So it got me kind of interested. Was there a branch of Fletts in Essex that I didn't know about? But it turns out he was actually a Fleet from Cambridgeshire, and it's the only instance I know where a Fleet has been called a Flett, because most of you who are called Fletts have probably been called Fleets at some time in the past. My first driving licence was Jim Fleet Wilson for many years until I fixed it, because they'd never run into a Flett before. So we had the opposite going on here. Most of you will have heard of the Fletts Fi Flotta. You'll maybe have heard of this famous song called Flett Fi Flotta, written by Donald MacLeod. Now this commemorates and was co-written by a man called Arnott Flett, who was born in 1910 from Flotta, and he was a piper in the Seaforth Highlanders in the Second War. And they were sharing a train together with this Donald MacLeod, and they wrote this song, and it was inspired by his unique way of walking. But I haven't actually heard the tune, so there's still more for me to learn about the Fletts as well. We actually have a number of Knights of the Realm in the Flett family. The first one is Sir John Smith Flett here. He was a director of the British Geological Survey, and his family came from Tufta in Bimbister in Harray. He was another Harray Flett. And he was actually the brother of P.C. Flett, the Provost of Kirkwall, another Provost of Kirkwall, this time in the Second War years and around then. And Sir John had a son, also a Sir Martin Teal Flett, who worked with the Decca and was a civil servant. So a very successful family of Fletts there from Tufta in Harray. Like many Orcadian families, we have many cousins who are actually mixed race people in Canada, who are a mix of European and native Canadian people, the so-called Métis people. And I found on the internet a couple of Fletts here, particularly Rod Flett, who was Métis, and he was a trophy-winning ice hockey player. He had a brother, Magnus, who also played in the ice hockey teams, and I just liked his name, Magnus Linklater Flett. You don't get more Orcadian than that. But this is a mixed-race man who had Native American ancestry. And there's even a Bill Flett, another ice hockey player, who turns up, who is probably, I assume, a relative of Rod Flett, but I literally haven't had time to check. There's just so many Fletts. And Wikipedia has pages about them, various ones I've mentioned and other ones, but my favourite one of all, I don't know whether they included it in my Radio Orkney piece this morning, was a man called Keith Flett from London North 17. He's a socialist historian and a prolific letter writer to the newspapers of note in the United Kingdom. And these letters he writes so often that they've gotten a nickname. They're called Fletters. He's also the founder of the Beard Liberation Front. I hadn't heard of it either, but it exists to campaign against the trend of Labour politicians removing their facial hair to show a more moderate, presentable image to the public. He also campaigns more widely against pogonophobia, which is the hatred or fear of beards. So a very diverse family, I think you would agree. There's even a Flett Glacier in Canada on Mount Rainier in Washington State, and it's named after a botanist, John B. Flett, whom I have not yet traced either. As I said, there's just too many of them. I happened to be looking into the Napoleonic War records for people from Orkney and Shetland just a couple of weeks ago, and in these allotment books where you allot who your salary should go to if you die, of HMS Trusty, 1807 to 1809, here I think you can read it, we have a Magnus Flett and we have a William Flett, and they have allotted their salaries to their mother, Catherine. So this kind of took my interest. I didn't know any of the Fletts were in the Napoleonic Wars. HMS Trusty was a massive old ship of the line, 50-gun, fourth-rate ship of the line. Here's her plans, launched, I think, in Sheerness in 1782. Then I could follow Magnus and William into their next ship, HMS Leiden. This was an upgrade, 64-gun, third-rate ship of the line, had been captured from the Dutch in 1799. And then they go their separate ways. Magnus goes on to HMS Standard, and William goes on to HMS Inflexible. At that point, I left them. Someone else will have to follow up the rest of their naval careers. But who were they? Clearly, I thought they must come from Orkney. It said Kirkwall, that they had signed on at Kirkwall. So we tried to work it out. And the Royal Navy really liked men about the age of 20. They wanted them to be young and fit, but to have had some seafaring experience. So 20 was about the optimal age. And Magnus was an ordinary seaman, so he was likely less than 24, otherwise he'd have made it to being an AB. And William, I assumed, was probably his younger brother, because he was a landsman, so that meant it was in your first year at sea. And we know their mother was Catherine, and they signed on in Kirkwall, or they may have been impressed. So I searched the old parish records, and immediately there were two very likely candidates. Here's a Magnus in 1787, and a William in 1790, born and baptized to a Magnus Flett and a Catherine Unson. So I went looking for them, and I can't find Magnus anywhere else again. He may have died in the Napoleonic Wars. But I can't find William. But Magnus turns up here in Stronsey in 1841, and his old mother, Catherine, still alive, claiming that she's 95 years old, but it would have made her over 50 when her last child was born, so I think she's exaggerating her age a bit. And later in the census, we find them. Magnus buys Airy, the big farm at Airy in Stronsey, and they're there in 61 and in 71. And I eventually got in touch with descendants of this family, and they confirmed my suspicion. It was the right man. They had an ancestor in the Napoleonic War, and he actually bought the farm at Airy with the money that he made out of the Royal Navy. But their story was that he'd been at Trafalgar with Nelson. So I went back and checked the muster rolls, but there are no Fletts at the Battle of Trafalgar, one thing that we didn't take part in. Now, this man, Magnus Flett, and his brothers and family actually have many, many descendants in the North Isles today. There's lots of folk from Westray come down from one branch, and various people in Stronsey from another branch. So we don't normally think of Flett as contributing to the North Isles of Orkney, but they've gotten nearly everywhere through these people. What I want to do next is to take this Magnus Flett at the top here, who both times in the Stronsey census does not put his birthplace as Kirkwall. He puts it as St. Ola, and he's described on the death certificate of his children as a farmer. So I think he was a farmer in St. Ola. I'd quite like to work out what farm it was and see if we can go back through the wills or the registers of Sacine, where you transmit land from one person to another, to see how he links in to the other Flett families. And if any of you have studied this, please get in touch. Now, again, like most Orkney families, we have cousins all over the world, and there's a huge diaspora of Orcadians, particularly in Canada, on the prairies, in Australia, in New Zealand, and in the USA. But you can see from this map, taken from online sources of where the Fletts live in the world, that there are Fletts in Mexico, China, Japan, Brazil, most of the places, which is quite cool to think, and a big job if I actually want to try and trace them all. But if we zoom in now a little bit more closely in Britain, we can see actually there's lots of Fletts in England as well. That's maybe not so well known. In the cities of England, in London, in Liverpool, in Newcastle. Obviously, there's some in Edinburgh and Aberdeen and Glasgow and around. And they're just obviously been moving away from the source all these times. But the one place where the most Fletts live outside of Orkney is in the parish of Raffin in Banffshire that we already mentioned. So this includes the village of Fenechty, which is absolutely full of Fletts. I happened to be in the graveyard there, and it's like being in Harray. There's so many Fletts. And I couldn't believe, if we go to the 1881 census, there's 350 folk just about called Flett living in Banffshire at a time when there's only a little bit over 500 in Orkney. So there's really a very, very large contingent of Fletts there. We traced a lot of them back to a man, James Flett, born in 1660, so really quite long ago, and he was the son of another James Flett, and we don't know where he came from, but some say he came from Flotta. So they've been there for hundreds of years as well. We'll come back to where they come from in a little while. Now, the Fletts of Fenechty are actually interesting to me because they've actually given rise to new branches of a surname. There's a man called Alexander Flett who was born there in the 1730s, but he moved down to Lothian where no one had ever met a Flett before. So he got renamed Affleck to fit in with the local names. So there's lots of Afflecks who live in Edinburgh and in Lothian, and they're actually genetically Fletts. But it just wasn't a known name. It's like when Don Corleone came to America and they just renamed him to something that suited them. So the Afflecks of East Lothian are actually Fletts. And in fact, the Fletts who bed in Pappy in Orkney in recent times also descend not from the Orcadian Fletts, but from the Raffin Fletts. Now, coming closer to home, to Orkney, where do we see the Fletts? Well, of course, I expected them all to be in Harray, but I was sorely disappointed to find out there's actually more Fletts in Stromness than in Harray. But the Fletts have been in Utterton since at least the 1600s. But after that, Harray is the next most common, and you can see there's a lot of Fletts in Orfer, a real stronghold of the Fletts for hundreds of years. In Kirkwall, in Firth, there are quite a lot of Fletts, and in Bursey, and then with considerably smaller amounts of Fletts in the other places. Flotta, that's quite famous, only has a slither of Fletts, but then there's not that many folk in Flotta altogether. So I've done this as a proportion of all Fletts, rather than as a proportion of all the people who live in the place. So that's in 1851, to try to get back before the age of people moving around so much. And there's 735 people called Flett in Orkney at that time. But if you ask me where do they all come from, I would say to you they come from Netherbroch in Harray. So Netherbroch is a township in Harray by the side of the loch to the south of the Netherbroch burn. To the north of the Netherbroch burn is a district called Russland, and that's where Roy and my ancestors were millers in the mill of Russland for many centuries. This is a very famous old farm called Fursa in Netherbroch, also a Flett house for many centuries. So who was the first Flett that we know anything about? The first Flett in Harray was a man here called John of Harray, and he was a Roythman, and his father was also a Roythman. So a Roythman is a hereditary status that you get to be part of the law committee. So it's actually a very sort of high-grade individual. There's a pool of these Roythmen that are used to fill up when laws need to be made and people need to be judged. So they tend to descend from sort of kinsmen of the earls in the olden times. And sure enough, we go back further. There's a couple called Colbain and William who are appending their seals to a complaint of the Orkney commoners in 1424. And you'll probably all have heard of Thorkel Flett, who's in the Orkneyinga Saga. Now, Thorkel Flett was always a bit of a mystery to me because Thorkel Flett's land was at Tukwai in Westray. And as we know, there's not really any Fletts in Westray. But it would appear that he's lost this land in various kinds of fights that were going on between his side of things and Sweyn Asliferson's side of things. And Margaret Flaws has postulated the theory that Haflidi Thorkelson, next generation of Fletts, was perhaps given Netherbroch by Earl Paul of Orkney. Well, we can never really know what exactly happened. But luckily, we can use genetics to go back before Netherbroch and ask the question, but where did the Fletts come from before they lived in Orkney or Banff or Essex or anywhere else they got to? And we can do this by using the Y chromosome. So it's a kind of undignified piece of DNA, this kind of little ugly ball up at the top right there. This is the X chromosome, and this is the Y chromosome. It's a piece of DNA that's inherited down the generations from father to son to grandson to great-grandson. Very, very like a surname in the Western world. It's only carried by men, and it doesn't do very much. It just encodes the fact that the baby becomes a boy and not a girl, which is the default genetic program. And it has many, many markers, we call them, or variants, little bits of DNA that vary between you and me, between your neighbours. And we can use these markers to basically build a family tree without paper. Instead of reading old documents and hunting around for Napoleonic War veterans, I can rather read the DNA code inside every man's Y chromosome. And you see these little changes every generation, much like a coat of arms changes. Two cousins in a family would have similar but not identical coats of arms because they make small changes as they go down the generation. So we can build these deep family trees that bridge over the time where there's no actual records. So we did this with some of the Fletts, first starting with our own family, the Fletts of North Biggin, also the Fletts of Fursa and Howen, who are our cousins, and they all link together nicely. And then deeper in the past, you could see that they related to other Orcadian families. So Telliers from Marwick, Burgers and Burgesses of Westray and Pappy origins. And deeper still in the past, they started to link to people from Shetland. The Chain family, or Sheen, as they call it in Shetland, then links in deeper in the past. So you're seeing this deep family tree that's going before surnames, deeper and deeper into the past. If you go further back than this, it suddenly lights up, and you start to see Sweden, Norway, Sweden, Finland, Rogaland, Finland. This is Scandinavian. You're hitting into all of these Scandinavians. Not close down here. You've got to get back beyond Orkney, beyond 1,000 and some years ago. And actually, this type accounts for 1.5 or 1.2% of all Norwegians. And it's really very common in Hordaland. 6% of people there. This is a very Western Norwegian type that is the source of this Flett family in Harray. What then about all the other Fletts? Well, I've actually been very lucky to... First we have to compare this. So I like to compare the genetic tree to the family tree built by traditional methods. And actually it works quite well here. There was a man, Robert Flett of Bia, who was born about 1630, lived in Netherbroch in Harray, and he had 7 sons. But he was quite a wealthy man. He left each of them a farm and half the mill of Rusland to two of them. And the Fletts of all these farms in the west mainland of Orkney come down from William, from Alexander, and from Thomas. And these are the people whom I tested here. So it's making quite good sense. This marker, 7672, is the marker of Rob Flett of Bia. Anyone on earth has that marker, they come down from him, whether they know it or whether they don't. So what about all the other Fletts? Well, they're quite amazing. I've been really lucky to have so many people come forward, but all of these Fletts, the Fletts of Hunscott and the Fletts of Tufta in Harray, plus the Fletts from Stromness, Flotta, Orfer, Kirkwall, Stennis, Bursley, they all match one another. They all come down from one man. I had multiple Fletts from Banff, some Afflecks from Lothian that matched in, and many, many men called Flat. So they live in America and they're called Flat, but they're genetically Fletts. They're in New Jersey, Tennessee, Maryland, and Pennsylvania. Multiple different Fletts have arrived, and they've had their name changed as they entered America because nobody had heard of a Flett. So all these men are all related to one another, all in one big, deep family. And just like the other branch that we looked at, as you go deeper into the past, you start linking into other Orkney names. First to Cuts from North Ronaldsay, then to Works from Shapmonsea, Bakeys from Stennis, Borwicks, Marwicks, and deeper back in time to the Papley family that may descend from Sigurd of Papley. There are also Nicholsons and others who descend from this lineage. And just the same as before, you go a step further back yet, and bingo, you're back into Scandinavia. This is a much rarer lineage. Only 0.3% of Norwegians belong to it, and they're focused in Uppland and places in the east of Norway. So I think this is an Eastern Norwegian lineage. We also see some Shetlanders here, Polsons from Hwalza, and Georgesons, and so on. So we're seeing two. Oh yes, we have to compare it to the family tree. So what's this going on here? I think these guys are all the descendants of Magnus Flett of Hobbister, the guy I introduced the talk with because he's buried in the cathedral. And it means that this marker here, 6351, relates to Magnus Flett of Hobbister and probably to John Flett of Harray, whom we also mentioned. So as I said, he's got a lovely gravestone. If you go into the cathedral, up to St. Ronald's Chapel, it's on the right-hand side. It's the last stone on the right-hand side. You see it here. He was married to a woman. You see the MF, Magnus Flett, and he married Bigus Tullach. So it has the Flett arms impaling the Tullach arms. They're pretty worn away, but when the cathedral's stained glass windows were made, they improved it to this that you can see in the south transept if you ask them to have a look. So we have two R1A lineages, two Flett Norwegian Viking founder lineages, accounting for all the Flett men that I have tested from Orkney or Banff or the Flats from the USA. Other people have other ideas, and some people have argued for a Danish origin. The late Margaret Flaws was one of them, and she thought the Fletts might descend from Harald Fleet, a guy who was a descendant of the Joms Vikings in Denmark, from a place called Jelling in Denmark. But we see no evidence, zero evidence of any Danish links. None of the Y chromosome connections have a match to either of the Flett branches in Denmark. And so I think this is simply a theory and not one that's right. So let's move on, as advertised, to Sinclair. Roy's grandmother was a Sinclair, and as everyone here I think will know, the Sinclairs supposedly come from Normandy. They moved from there to England, probably around the time of the Norman conquest, and then later moved up to Scotland in the time of King David I. So the Sinclair place is here in Normandy, just to the south of the D-Day beaches. And here you can see them being granted the barony of Roslin near Edinburgh, along with various other families who have a Norman origin, the Ramsays, the Giffords, and so on and so forth. So they were established in Caithness by 1322, and by 1364, Tom Sinclair was the governor of Orkney. But they reached the peak of their powers in 1379, when Henry Sinclair was made the Jarl of Orkney. This was inherited through his mother's side from the Mormaer of Strathearn. But this was really the peak of their powers. It's the second most common name in Orkney today. It was the first, the most common name, for hundreds of years, but has been knocked off the top spot. It's also very, very common in Shetland. It was in the top 10 in the 19th century. And it's actually the most common name in my Viking 2 study, because we get the Shetland ones and we get the Orkney ones joining in the study. Now, Gregor Lamb, who's very interested in Orkney surnames, proposed that this really high frequency of the name came from people taking on the surname. It was a thing in the past. If you had the same surname as the Earl, you might get some favours done, and he thought this might be the case. When we look in our data, 66% of the supposedly unrelated Sinclair men are all actually in one lineage. So it's actually pretty good for such a common name. And I think they all descend from Earl Henry of Orkney, because they all match a descendant from the Earl of Caithness, whom I persuaded to take a DNA test. This is very powerful evidence that they come down from this line. And I don't actually see any evidence for surname adoption. What I see is evidence a very powerful family, men, were able to have many children with many women, and thus there were many Sinclairs born in the next generation, and they inherited that ability because they were noblemen. And this is a pattern we see in other parts of the world as well. So let's have a look at the genetics. Here again we have a tree, just like a family tree, but deeper in time. The closer together two people are, the more closely related they are. And ignore these marker names. These are genetic marker names. Like your car has a number plate, so it's your car. We have to give these markers names so that we can speak about them specifically. So we have a lot of samples of Sinclairs from the north. First off here are a bunch of Sinclairs with ancestry from Caithness, including the Sinclair of Ulster line, going back to the Earl of Caithness, and Sinclairs of Latheron and Dunbeath. So we can be very confident that this 35613 line goes back to William II Earl of Caithness. But what's cool is when we then look at the Orkney ones, we have Harray Sinclairs, Sandy Sinclairs, St Ola Sinclairs, also some from Unst in Shetland, and even some from East Lothian. They all link together in the same tree as well, which means that this marker here, 15254, is almost certainly the marker of Henry Sinclair and his ancestors back in Roslin. But what happens with this tree when we go deeper in time? Where did these Sinclairs come from? Well, it's pretty cool actually for this whole Norman story, because their nearest relatives are the Comyn, or nowadays they call themselves Cummings family, who are also Normans. So we have two prominent Scottish Norman families who are actually genetically related to one another. So we can then go one stage further back and ask, because everyone learns at school, the Normans, Normandy is named after the Norsemen, right? They came to the north of France and took it over. So these guys, in theory, many Sinclairs believe they actually come from Norway the long way around, from Norway to Normandy, to England, to Scotland, to Orkney. But I'm afraid it's just not true, because their nearest relatives are in Germany. And we see this with many, many Norman lineages. There are very few Norsemen in Normandy. There must have been some, because there are Norse names there, place names, but most of them descend from a people known as the Franks. So the Franks were a Germanic-speaking people in what's now France, and where the name France comes from. And I believe the Sinclairs of Orkney, Caithness, and Shetland are actually Normans. Earlier than that, they descend from the Franks. And that's how you can get some Germanic blood in Orkney. That wasn't obvious to me when I first started these things 20 years ago. So, now we have another lineage, 4031. And there's a couple of lines of evidence here with this one. It was first identified amongst genetic genealogists. It was very, very common in Sweden. It was also seen in Norway. And as time went by, it expanded out, more and more Norwegians, yet more Swedes, and even a few English. So it's very, very Scandinavian. When we looked in our data in the north and west of Scotland, nearly 5% of people carried this type. They all came down from one man. It was a bit unusual. Whereas in the rest of the British Isles, it was only about 0.5%. So there's a tenfold uplift in the north. And this is really a classic Scandinavian Viking sort of pattern. When we broke down the north and west of Scotland, it was really all coming from Orkney and Caithness. Hardly any of this in the Western Isles, hardly any of it in Shetland. It's reaching 10% in Orkney and Shetland. So it looks to be another case of a powerful man leaving many descendants, this so-called social selection. And then there came another line of evidence from Clan Gunn, who live in Caithness. As you might know, they claim descent from a man called Gunny. And Gunny was a grandson of Sweyn Asleferson, whom we mentioned before, was in in a sort of a battle with Thorkel Flett. And I actually have been able to get over 50 different gun men to test, and 36% of them match each other very closely. This is probably the bona fide, real gun original Y chromosome, and it's also in the 4031 group. It matches the Swedish group. The third line of evidence I have here is the Swanson family. So the Swansons come from Hoy and from Caithness, and they also claim descent from Swain. You can tell by their surname. There are not so many of them. I managed to find 3 who weren't closely related to each other, and they all matched each other. They all matched 4031. They matched the guns. They matched the Swedes. So we've got a group here that I think probably comes down from Sweyn Asleferson. Eric Linklater called him the ultimate Viking. In the Orkneyinga Saga, it says, his drinking hall was so big, there was nothing in Orkney to compare with it. In the spring, he had more than enough to occupy him, with a great deal of seed to sow, which he saw to carefully himself. Then when that job was done, he would go off plundering in the Hebrides and in Ireland. I think this is just the kind of man who might have left a cluster of descendants. And I'm trying not to have a literary reading of these words. So what does the genetics say? Here we have a tree again. Hopefully you can read them by now. There are all these marker names. You can ignore them, but there's different branches of the tree. And this is extremely Scandinavian. Sweden, many Swedes, Norway, Finns, Hordaland, Rogaland, Telemark, Uppland, all over the place. But of interest to people from Orkney, the Corsi family and the Kors family in Orkney both match each other, and they match the Jonsson family from Fair Isle, Dunrossness, and Whalsa in Shetland. There's also a skeleton from 950 AD from the Isle of Man, a Viking skeleton that fits into this part of the tree. So we're seeing a very Scandinavian group, and here down at the bottom are the Gunn family and other Caithness families, Sutherlands, Morrisons, the Ski family from Sandy and other places in Orkney. The Swansons are there. And why is this of any interest here for our memorial lecture? Because, oh no, I keep forgetting where I'm at. So I've made the point that I believe this could be Sweyn Asleferson's family. And why is it of interest here for the memorial lecture for Roy? Well, because, of course, the Drever family from Orkney, all of those I've tested, including some of Roy's close family, match into this lineage. And this is how we reach 10% of Orkney when you count the Drevers, the Skis, and so on and so forth. I think they all come down from a Swedish Viking origin. Now, the last family I'm going to talk about today are the Linklaters, because Roy's great-grandmother was a Linklater, and they have a slightly different story. We found a marker long ago now in a man who came down from Rasmussen's in Norway, so I'm thinking, oh, well, probably a Viking marker, isn't it? But in all the 15 years in between, I've not seen another Norwegian or a Swede or a Finn or a Dane with this marker. And so I think I was wrong. What happens instead is that lots of Scottish people have this marker. And this is the marker carried by many Linklaters in Orkney, including the Linklaters of Linklater in Sandwick, where they originated from. And what's the most interesting thing about this to me is that the nearest genetic kin of the Linklaters are the MacLeods of MacLeod, the MacLeods of Dunvegan Castle on Skye, the MacLeods of Harris. They're almost indistinguishable from the Linklaters. They both come down from one man less than 1,000 years ago. So this is actually quite cool. We're seeing these links between the Western Isles and the Inner Hebrides and Orkney through our DNA. And it's not because of Vikings this time. I believe these lineages are Pictish. These lineages are coming from before the arrival of the Norse, coming from indigenous people who lived in the Hebrides and in Orkney. Slightly different, perhaps, from the Picts who lived in what's now Perthshire and Angus. When we look at the paper families and the oral history, we see that MacLeod of Dunvegan relates into MacLeod of Lewis, and they come down supposedly from an ancestor very long ago called Liot. Now, Liot means ugly in Old Norse, so it's obviously a slightly disparaging nickname. And I don't yet know, because I haven't got the tests back from my cousin Magnus Linklater, when exactly they link in, whether the Linklaters come down from Liot or from a cousin of Liot. But people agree now that Liot's great-grandfather was a fellow called Olvir, and there's a theory circulating around that perhaps Olvir was actually in Orkney, maybe the same man as Olvir Rosta in the Orkneyinga Saga. In any case, somehow or another, Liot is related to Christy Illingaklet, who is the founder of the Linklater family. So I have more work to do on this to see how precisely they link. But one way or another, the Linklaters and the MacLeods are kin. So I hope I've given you a bit of a flavour of the things we can do with genetics by going through 4 different Orkney surnames. I hope I'm young enough I can do this with many, many other Orkney surnames and put it all together, because then we would have literally the history of the people of Orkney. That's what interests me when I'm not studying actionable genetic variants. This is just really my hobby. But I want to thank very many people in Edinburgh and elsewhere all around the world who've helped with this kind of work over time, many different funding bodies, but most of all to all the volunteers, both in academic studies like Viking genes, without whom we couldn't learn this, but also single individuals that I've contacted all over the world because they have an interesting Y chromosome and they can shine a light on this. It's when you put it all together you learn the most, rather than ploughing your own furrow on your own. If you're interested in genetic genealogy of Orkney, get in touch, but don't expect an immediate reply. I have a pretty big email inbox. That's it. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Jim. That was absolutely fascinating. My dear departed father, he was an enthusiastic amateur Brechin historian, and he researched our family tree, but looking at library records and parish records before the internet. He would have been absolutely taken by this genetic tool for tracing the family history, and goodness knows what it would have revealed in my family, I can tell you. Now, we've got time for a few questions or comments from the audience, and I'm hoping, expecting that from such a large audience we're going to pick up a few questions. So if anyone has anything, can you put your hands up? Oh, there's one right at the back, Catherine, as well, so you can keep yourself fit up there, and we'll kick off with them. I've got one question here from you, came in Slido here. It's possibly a bit mischievous. It was, as per your DNA testing, what percentage are you Norwegian?
Me?
Yeah.
These kind of individual percentage measures have to be taken with a pinch of salt, because you'll take something from one company and you'll be 10% this, and then 3 years later you'll be 30% that. And so it's an imprecise science. I don't know if I've measured my own one particularly. So the people of Fair Isle are at the lower end of the scale, so I'm half from Fair Isle. They're something like 14% Scandinavian, and the people of Harray and Bursey are actually the high end of the Orkney scale, about 19%. So you can take the average of those two numbers, and that'll be me.
Cool. That's good.
Oh, thank you for a very interesting talk. Just wanted to add another Flett to your list. When I was researching Balfour Stewart from my talk yesterday, I found that one of his executors was William Heddle Flett, the provisions preserves manufacturer. And
Yes,
he was
I've heard of him. I'll have to add him into my list.
He was importing anchovies and capers and so on in the 1880s to Liverpool.
Wow.
So W.H. Flett Limited.
Catherine, we've got a questioner right up at the back.
Can you tell me about the Spanish connection with the Armada, and in particular the Drevers? So I'm interested because I'm 2% Spanish myself.
Are you trying to get me in trouble? So, in Westray, there were these people called Dons, supposedly, according to some people in the Hewison family. And they descended from a ship wrecked on the Reef Dyke, I think, in North Ronaldsay, and they married together with one another for 200 years, with various surnames like Reed and so on, and then they sort of integrated with the rest of the Isle. If you go to Westray, you'll find people claiming this ancestry. When we looked 15 years ago, we could find absolutely zero indication of Spanish ancestry in Westry. However, things have moved on a huge amount, and it's coming time I need to look again with more up-to-date techniques. You have to realize at that point in the past, anyone who is an ancestor of one person in Westry is an ancestor of everyone in Westry, and indeed many other parts of Orkney. So the argument that I haven't sampled the right people just doesn't work. Spaniards are very similar. Western Europeans are extremely similar to one another. So it was quite a hard question 15 years ago. But I can see I'll need to get to the bottom of it using the best approaches we have. We have people now, we have much, much more information. So yeah, I'll go and look again, but don't hold your breath. We saw nothing when we looked before.
Sorry to ask a awkward question, but you mentioned the Fair Isles as well. I mean, Spaniards were in Fair Isles as well, weren't they?
No, I think that's complete and utter nonsense, actually. My granddad told me they were starving in Fair Isle, and when you met a Spaniard at the edge of the banks, you just bowled them out of the shore because it was one less buddy to fight our tatties or whatever they were. They probably didn't even have tatties back then to fight our food way. I see absolutely no evidence of Spanish blood in Fair Isle either, and I've looked much more recently at that one, and we saw nothing. I've looked in Galway as well for people there who claim it, and I don't see it there either. So you could either surmise that Jim Wilson doesn't know how to find Spanish DNA, or there's no Spanish DNA to be found. But we'll come back another year when we've got the answer.
There's one over there. Great. There's one down here next as well, Catherine.
Did you come across Lester Flatt in Tennessee of Flatt and Scruggs, the bluegrass group? Is he a Flatt?
I don't know, and I can't discuss individual cases even if he was. The question then is, are there other Flats in the USA who are not genetically Fletts? There are. They're Van Fleet from Holland. They also got called Flat. And my correspondent, his father, was so convinced that he was Dutch that he refused to believe when the genetics told him he was Orcadian. So there are Flats who are of Dutch extraction, and the rest are of Orcadian extraction.
The name Corrigal, which is the name of a district in Orkney, also happens to be my second name, because I'm descended from the Corrigals. And my mother brought me up telling me that Corrigal was a name that existed here in Orkney before there was a Scottish element. And I would like to know whether there's any. I'm sure the Corrigal family will one day be part of all that you're doing, but...
Well, I too descend from Corrigals, and we've done a little bit of work on them. They're first mentioned in 1489 about a dispute over a piece of land in Harray, so not much has changed. We have tested a number of Corrigals, but you'll have to wait for some future lecture to get the answer. They're potentially also Pictish. They have an unusual Y chromosome that I haven't come to a decision about. It's not Viking, so don't be too disappointed, but I think it might be Pictish. Well, that would be, because that would be Pictish continuity through the arrival of the Vikings. I'm not quite at the if you say something's Pictish, half the internet goes mental. How do you know? Because we weren't there, were we? But you can know nothing about the past without a time machine, so you have to make, a sort of surmise. And for the Linklater one, I'm 100% certain. For the Corrigal one, I'm coming.
Do you have views about whether place names come from human beings, or whether human beings adopt names from places?
In Orkney, many of the surnames come from place names, particularly township names, and I find that those families have a very high proportion of Norse ancestry, even though the custom of naming yourself after the land is a Scottish custom. But there was obviously a flux going on as these cultures interacted with one another. But the patronymic surnames, the son surnames of Shetland, Georgeson and Jarmson and whatnot, Paulson, are very enriched for Norse lineages, and the place names, surnames of Orkney, Icebister, Corston, Narston, and so on, Fubister, are very enriched for the same lineages in Orkney. So I think they both point back to the Norse connection.
I've got time for one more question before we go on to a very special vote of thanks.
Yes, it's a very brief question about the Fletts. The one kind of very well-known Flett in Orkney is Flett and Sons. Are they related as well?
Well, I already said I can't discuss particular cases. There are rules that we have to follow. Yeah, that's it.
Right, now I normally give the vote of thanks at these events, but in this memorial lecture we have someone much more appropriate to give the vote of thanks. So Mike, could I invite you up to the lectern to do your bit?
Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's a bit of a challenge, not just because of the numbers in here, but the number of Fletts or Linklaters that I know of. I would have to be very careful about what I say in here. Anyway, before I propose the vote of thanks to Eric and to James in particular, I'll add a little bit about Roy, the Roy Drever I know. And Lawrence embarked on what happened to Roy. And I'm going to enlarge on that a little bit because really it was only later after he died I really began to think back on these times when these things happened. And when Roy had this accident, there was about 5 days where it was touch and go whether he was going to survive. And all this time he's in the hospital in Aberdeen. And it was a long recovery period. But I was in Aberdeen because I was at university then, and my father and brother went home when it was clear he was going to survive. So I was going up to see him every day. And this would have, I'm thinking of probably about 5 or 6 weeks after he came out of the intensive care. I came in one day and he was being taught how to read Braille. Now he's 17 years old at that time. And it transpired that he had decided that his future lay in a way that would depend very much on finding a way to access information. And for him, it had to be Braille. And he didn't consult me, he didn't consult my father or anything. He had made a decision that this was the way he had to go. And I think then, when I thought about it, I says, from that time on, it was the ferocious ambition to live a normal life. And that's what drove him on. When he was 16, he finished school, went back to become a lab technician. In his final exams, he got 1 O-level in arithmetic. Once he had this accident where he lost the sight of both eyes and he lost his left hand, he actually went to the blind school in Edinburgh for, I think, 2 terms and gave it up simply because they weren't ambitious enough. They didn't want to give him the things he wanted. That was education improvement. So he came back to Orkney and enrolled in the grammar school, again as a pupil, and he would have been 19 then. And it was actually the medical work that was done by the staff and senior pupils in the school at that time that made this happen. He had 1 O-level when life was absolutely easy. When life became impossibly difficult, he took 4 good hires, enrolled in Edinburgh University, took a degree and a diploma in computing, and then on job, family, but that was driven by what I can only call ferocious endeavour to live a normal life, and that's what he did. I mean, the achievement was absolutely immense. Anyway, I have to, having listened to Jim there, and I've heard him talk about these things before, but for him, it's pretty much the same kind of thing, because it's the enormous drive to go through all this stuff to produce the kind of information he's giving you today. I'm just absolutely impressed by your dedication to this role. And it's a very nice delivery. I noticed your comment there about the land issues in Harray, which is something to be desired, you know. One thing I'm going to divert from that a little bit, because one thing I promised myself, I would tell you a couple of little stories about Roy. Well, it's not so much about Roy, it's about his first dog, Scappa. When he went to Edinburgh University, in his first term, he found it it's quite easy to get disorientated because he didn't know the city, and the dog has to go where he wants it to go. And on one of his first excursions out with the dog, he got disorientated and lost. And he stopped at what he was quite sure was a crossing, and he somehow contacted somebody who was walking by, and it was a lady. And he explained to her his situation, that he was lost, and where should he go? And the thing is that when people are not used to speaking to blind people, they tend to say, well, you go down there and go into the right, or you go down there to the left, which of course means nothing at all to a blind person. So this dialogue was going on, and a man came along, and Roy just said, he just said to the woman, look, there's no point speaking to him, you've got to speak to the dog. You could tell stories about Roy all day, but this one is about Scappa, because when Roy was at the university, he lived in a bed sit for a while before he got a flat. So I was down, I think, at a teacher meeting of some kind or other. So I went and stayed with Roy in this little bed sit, and there was just a single bed in it. And Roy slept in the bed, and Scappa slept beside the bed, and I slept in a sleeping bag beyond the dog. So it was, I think, a Friday morning, and he had exams, so he got up quite early and went out. And when he went out, Scappa got up, got into bed, and got under the downy. And she lay there with her head above the downy and her nose sticking out of the edge of the bed, and she looked at me, and you just could see the statement coming out, well, what are you going to do about it then? And the answer was, I didn't do anything about it, because obviously that happened every time Roy went out. I'll tell you one other story which involved Roy spending the night in the cells on a university night out. Now, I can't pass on to you the other participant in this escapade, but they spent, for pinching a traffic cone or something like that, and had to spend the whole night in the cells. I won't add any more to it than that at this moment in time. So, but to get back to Jim Wilson. Jim, that was an absolutely fabulous lecture. I'm so pleased to be here to hear it like that. And long may your work continue. And I think I can speak for all the Fletts here. It's great to have our history kind of revealed in that scientific form. So, thank you very much indeed. And Howie, of course, because he set this whole festival up all these years ago. Congratulations. Well earned. Yeah. Thank you.